Okay, I'm about to present the solution from the challenge, at least how I went about accomplishing this. Please do not worry if your solution is not identical to mine. There are several different ways of going about this because we have several different ways of getting our activities that a user is attending. You may or may not have chosen to use Automapper. And of course, there's just always more than one way to achieve the same goal. So the way that I've done it is, well, we've had a starting point, our user activity DTO. That was step number one. And we already had this in place. The next step was to go and create a list activities handler in our profile class. And oops, we've got an unused import in there. And inside here, we've got a class called list activities. This is going to be our handler. And we've got our query because we're retrieving data. Now, I didn't worry about paginating this result, but obviously you could do and make this a paged list instead of a list. But in order to keep things relatively simple, I've just gone for a normal list and we're going to return all of the activities. But it's not a big step to make this a paged list. I've then got two properties in here. We're going to take the username, the user's profile we're on that we're interested in looking at the activities, as well as a predicate to say whether or not we're looking at the past events, the future events, or the events the user is hosting. We've then got our handler, and we brought in here, or I have, both the data context, of course, we want to get stuff from the database, and also IMapper in this case, so that I can use the project to function to go from the activity attendees table, in my case, to the user activity DTO. So the way I've gone about this is I've built up my query expression and I've queried the activity attendees table. Now you may have gone a different way at this point. You may have gone to get the user directly and then queried the activities that user has in that table. Both ways are fine. I just found this way a bit easier and it makes the SQL query a bit cleaner at the end. But the main goal was to get this working. Not about how you did it, just get something that works that returns the information you're looking for. So from this table, I've gone and got the activities where the app user username matches the request.username. And then I've ordered by the activity date. Then I'm using projection to go from the activity attendee to the user activity DTO. And this query gives me a list of user activity DTOs. And at this point, we're just as queryable, so we're not executing anything to the database yet. Then I'm building up the query based on the predicate, and I've used a switch expression to go ahead and do things depending on what is in that predicate. Now I'm just using strings to keep it nice and simple. We've got past, we've got hosting, and then the default case is going to be future events. So nothing surprising about the queries here. We're just checking the date is less than the date time now for the past. The query where the host username is the request username is going to give us the events the user's hosting. And it was the very specific reason to give us access to this property. And that's why I added this inside the user activity DTO. I'm not interested in returning this, and that's why I've added the JSON ignore here. But it does give us access to that property, which means we can query our database via our activity DTO to get the host username that matches the request.username. And then we go and get our activities and send it to a list async. And then we return a successful result with those activities, and it's a type of list of user activity DTO that we're returning. Now, because we're using projection here, we need to go from the activity attendee to the user activity DTO. So inside the mapping profiles, what I've got is a mapping to do exactly this. Now we need to populate all of the properties inside the user activity DTO. There's no way for Automapper to work this out all by itself. So we've got our mapping for every single property inside there. And again, there should be no surprises here. But using projection makes our SQL query a bit cleaner. The only other task then in our API was to create a new endpoint. And all we've got here is an HTTP GET for the username, whoever it is, and /activities, and we're taking the string of the username from the root parameter, and then the predicate I'm getting from the query string. So we're able to pass in two string parameters into our getUserActivities method here, and then we're just simply returning the handle result, just as we've done many times before. So I'm going to open up the console just so we can take a look at the query that's made when I go ahead and make this particular request. So I'll just head back to Postman and I'll just send and go and get Bob's past activities, click on send, and then if I go take a look at the console, we can see the query that's being made, and it's about as small as I've managed to get it in terms of what we're doing here, with all of the joins of the tables in terms of our SQL query that goes to our database and gets that data back out of there. So then once we've got success in the Postman tests, then we can move over to our client. And inside the agent file, what we've got inside here is just another request in the profiles object to go and list the activities. Now I've just passed in the username and predicate as two string properties. I've used a username for the endpoint that's going to be substituted, of course, with this username, and the predicate I'm just sending up directly as an add-on to our URL as the query string, then putting the predicate in there. Just keeping it nice and simple for this. We're not creating, or I've not chosen to create URL search params and pass that in as parameters because there's only one that I need to send. It doesn't matter if you did create params object and sent it up. Remember, the goal is to get it working, not necessarily to do exactly the same things that I've done here. So once we have that in place, what we also need to do, in fact, what I've got here as well is a user activity type, and that says we're returning a user activity type from this particular request. So over in the profile.ts file, I've created an interface for the user activity that matches the properties that we're getting back from the API. And then I was able to use that inside the agent file to give us some type safety when we go and get this particular request and the response back from our API. So once we have that in place, we can then go to our profile store, and I'll just scroll up to the top, and inside here I've added two properties, one to store the user activities, which is going to be initialized as an empty array, and another one to load the activities, and given it a starting value of false. And then inside this store, if I just scroll down and find the load user activities method, then pretty straightforward. We've done this sort of thing before. We're just going to send the username and the predicate. And the predicate is optional because we're going to return the default case if we do not send up a predicate. And then we get our loading activities flag set to true. We go and call the method in our agent.ts file. And then it's just a case of setting the properties in the store for the user activities, and we'll turn off our loading flag afterwards. And then we've just got our normal error handling there. And then we need to go and create a profile activities component. So this one is a bit of work because there's a bunch of semantic UI components to create the styling for a profile card, but I'll just talk you through what I've done inside here. So inside here I've got panes, tab panes that we've used before, but in this case we've got the menu items, past events, future events, hosting. But slightly differently here, I've given each pane a key, which I'll be able to access and then use when we call our load activities method. So those are our panes, and you may not have done it this way because I didn't demonstrate this earlier, this functionality. I just used the active index directly. And again, if you did it that way, that's equally fine. The goal, remember, is just to get something that works. But this is a way that we can access the property that we're interested to send this up as the predicate to our load activities method. Then we've got our normal export default observer, etc. And we're going to get our profile store, and then I've just destructured the properties we need in here from the store itself. And then we've got our use effects to go ahead and load the user activities when we load our component. Now we're only interested in the default case when we initially load our component, so we're not sending up a predicate. And what we also have, because we're using tabs, then we've got a method to handle the changing of the tab. Now, the handle tab change, if we go take a look at this particular method, it takes an event as a parameter, and then we can get the data, which is a type of tab props. And I've just gone ahead and set the type for the synthetic event because I'm not really interested in the event. I'm only interested in the data here. And then what I've done in the case of our load user activities here, passing in the username again, but I'm using the square bracket syntax, the property key accessor, and I'm passing in the data active index, which is a number, but because the active index can be a string or a number, then I've specified as number. And then I'm accessing the pane.key. And if we go ahead and look at our panes, then in order to access the key, I need to use pane.key, and then this will be set to whatever the index is that I'm accessing. And then we've just got a loading flag for loading the activities, and the rest of this content is just normal semantic UI stuff to style it. And we've got a card group and cards and image, card content, and we've looked at this kind of thing before. And then it's just a case of adding this to the profile content component and updating this particular menu item. And that's what we do to get the results that I saw in the browser earlier on. So hopefully you gave that a go, and hopefully even if you didn't make it, you learned something whilst doing so. And the solution makes some kind of sense. And I'll emphasize again, please don't be concerned if your solution is different to mine in any way, because there are multiple different ways of achieving this particular goal. So I'm going to commit my changes into source control because this brings us to the end of this particular section. And I'm going to say end of section 21 and stage and commit these changes into source control. And we'll wrap up with a summary.